And we are back with more on News Talk Saga 960. So very glad you could join us on this edition of the Mark Petronas Show. Well, in case you haven't noticed, we're in the midst of a banking crisis in the United States. These things tend to spread, despite the fact that Canadian banks have consistently been among the more stable around the world. They're bound to feel the impact of what's going on south of the border. And now we have several banks now that have teetered and collapsed. Bigger banks are coming in, taking over some of them, spending all sorts of money to essentially uh, envelop, take over the small regional banks. Is this a good thing? I don't personally think it is, because the more you centralize stuff, then the more you make it likely that there's going to be an element of control to all of this. I don't like it. I think it's a terrible development. And that's why it's so good to have Benjamin Dichter on the show, who's, he's my guy when it comes to all things related to Bitcoin. And, that's been the beneficiary, really, one of the main beneficiaries of what's going on with the banks, as Bitcoin now up, 60%, 70% so far in 2023, Benjamin?
Somewhere in the mid 70% since the beginning of the year.
What's going on? I mean, these banks are in a lot of trouble, and there's liquidity problems. There's a chart now looking at the banking crisis by the numbers. The three banks failing this year and another one teetering, others teetering. We're looking at Silicon Valley Bank, SVB. That's obviously in Silicon Valley based. First Republic Bank, Signature Bank. And, these are not small institutions. I mean, it's already being referred to as the worst banking crisis in the world, just in terms of by market cap. How bad is this thing going to get?
Who knows? Well, because of the opaqueness of the current financial system versus Bitcoin, we don't know, and we won't know until more of these banks continue to collapse. But it's interesting. I heard over the past couple of days that in 2008, if I remember correctly, something like $526 billion in assets were wiped out because of the bank failures. That was in 2008. So far, we've already surpassed that at $533 billion. And it's just 4 months into the year, man. So it's going to get very exciting. Who knows? But, I think what we're seeing is the government and the Fed is just papering over all of this stuff. That's why we haven't seen the credit crunch that would come along with this sort of collapse like happened last time. And everything is being moved into the larger banks that are going to be benefiting from it, because they're going to be capturing all of these mortgages, which are, to them, assets over the long term. And they're going to do, JP Morgan's going to do very, very well. And the government seems to be very, very excited to help JP Morgan grow.
Yeah. Big banks, Goldman Sachs, other institutions now snapping up some of these regional banks. I mean, are you as nervous about this situation as I am? I mean, the more you centralize, the more likely they're going to push more control on consumers, correct? I mean, this is all BlackRock related stuff. I mean, it's about control, right? It's about punishing people who, aren't into the environmental social governance thing, punishing companies that don't go along to get along. And some of these regional banks, you can't have too many of these institutions doing their own thing, attracting consumers who want more freedom. No, you've got to lure them into the huge organizations, the corporate woke governance institutions like Morgan Stanley, like Bank of America and other behemoths. But this isn't a good thing, because eventually they're going to push even harder for a central bank digital currency. Isn't that really where they want to go?
I don't think so. I think the CBDC concern is blown way out of proportion. A couple of things, not to, and believe me, I'm not defending BlackRock here, but something interesting that's come across my radar over the past couple of weeks is if you look at BlackRock as a company, if you took all the cash in the world, I don't mean money in bank accounts, but just cash floating around in all currencies, not just US dollars, just cash currency that is currently floating around in the economy of every currency in the world, the total cash that is in people's wallets right now around the world is approximately $7 trillion. BlackRock has $10 trillion under asset. So just to give you an idea of how large this company is, and BlackRock came up with this ESG system. And the reason apparently they came up with this ESG system was for valuation of their companies. So normally you're an investment bank, you're going to go in, you're going to buy shares in a company. Maybe you'll get somebody on the board that will just kind of give some insight from your perspective, and then that's it. But BlackRock is so big, they can't manage in that old system. So what they did is they came up with a scorecard, essentially, for all these companies based on their investments or their portfolio and what they're going to buy. And they would assign it a scorecard. Unfortunately, the scorecard they use is ESG, environmental, social, and governance, three things that have nothing to do with each other. It's completely crazy. It's a good way to shoehorn in all this climate change hysteria while simultaneously investing in the green energy grift, right? But yeah, so does it come from a place of, is it evil? I think it's just incompetence and the fact that BlackRock is just too big, right? They're just too big. But, we're not going to, other industries in the past that were subjected to antitrust laws, that's not being applied to BlackRock. But I think that's where so much of the problems are. Plus the fact that they're political, that they're very aligned politically in the United States, and it's just making a mess of things. And that's why there's an alternative. And that alternative is Bitcoin, where you don't have to participate in any of this nonsense because none of it is centralized. You're completely removed from the clown world financial system.
All right, let's talk about Bitcoin. It's been up dramatically at 60% so far in 2023. I mean, it's still nowhere near its all-time high, which is somewhere around $69,000 per coin, right? It's still a ways off from that.
Well, I would look at it a different way. It's significantly higher than the all-time high from the previous cycle. Remember, Bitcoin works in 4-year cycles. That's the algorithm that mints Bitcoin. And the supply is cut in half every 4 years. That's why we have a predictable model of how it works. And the last cycle, the top was 19,000, and it really leveled off around, I think the bottom was around the $2,000 to $3,000 mark. Now we're leveling off at the $30,000 mark, heading into the next halving, which will be approximately 12 months from now. I think it's going to be next May, actually. And we'll see shortly after that, maybe 6 months after, you'll see the results of the supply cut and what miners will be selling Bitcoin for, because their supply will be cut in half, and you'll see a massive or significant price spike. And as Greg Foss, the very well-known hedge fund manager who is now very, very bullish on Bitcoin, as he likes to say, it's just math. It's just math about supply, and that the supply gets cut, and you're going to see an increase in the price, especially as demand for the asset continues.
Yeah, but the Biden administration now talking about, here we see, for video viewers, we see Biden kissing somebody else.
What a weirdo.
Hair.
Yeah.
They want to put a tax on Bitcoin mining. They say Bitcoin mining is bad for the environment, and it's got a big footprint, carbon footprint. And so the way to deal with that is what, a 30% tax? Is that what they're talking about? Is this going to go anywhere?
It's absolutely crazy. I was in a space earlier today with people who are in the Bitcoin space, who are in Washington, who are engaging in lobbying the government on Bitcoin. There's this concern for a number of reasons. Firstly, all that does is make mining basically impossible in the United States. So all those miners will just leave and go to other jurisdictions that are friendly. And there's plenty of countries around the world that would like miners to invest in the infrastructure in their companies, and they'll just take advantage of it. And once again, the United States would lose if that's the case. But there's also something else that I notice people aren't talking about. That is in clear violation of common carrier laws, right? And when people buy electricity, or you buy a plane ticket or whatever, people don't know what common carrier laws are. Your electric company can't discriminate against you and how you use your electricity. They cannot discriminate and say, well, we're not going to give you electricity because we don't like your political opinions. That's called common carrier. And it's crazy to see that the United States is now trying to violate common carrier laws to implement this ridiculous tax of 30%. I don't think it's ever going to happen. I think it's a scare tactic. But my concern is if they are allowed to get away with it and allowed to determine how people can use electricity, well, get ready for the next SJW catastrophe that's going to destroy our planet. That will be the water crisis. And then they'll determine how you can use your water. Because if they get away with it for electricity, they'll apply it elsewhere. And that's how authoritarians operate. So that's what I'm really concerned about.
Yeah, and that's extremely troubling. I mean, if the United States were to go in that direction, but you don't think CBDCs are going to be a thing? I mean, we've heard the fear mongering, the warnings that this is where government wants to go, and part of the banking crisis appears almost engineered to consolidate the banking sector. Maybe you can't have CBDCs unless you consolidate, get rid of the regional players. As many of them, I mean, there's something like 4,800 banks in the United States. And so somewhere around half of them could have serious problems, financial problems, which is a lot. And so we may be only seeing the tip of the iceberg as far as this banking crisis. Couldn't this be used as a pretext to consolidate everything within the hands of a few huge players, assuming things get really bad, get rid of the small players, and at that point, meaning everybody is just herded in like sheep? And wouldn't they be in a position then, government, the BlackRocks of the world, to say, okay, it's time for a digital currency? It looks like they've been intentionally trying to destroy the US dollar with all their crazy moves. We've seen de-dollarization, right? Even in places like Brazil with their new Marxist president over there. All the BRIC nations devolving themselves, disassociating themselves, doing more trading in other currencies, like the yuan, for instance. Talk of a gold-backed currency other than the US dollar. I mean, isn't this about de-dollarization, destroying the US dollar, moving towards digital? Do you buy into that?
No. The United States is a country that has yet to abandon the penny. When they abandon the penny, then we'll start talking about totally revamping their dollar system and going to a CBDC. I don't think that's likely for a number of reasons. I mean, well, I just mentioned that. But firstly, there's the culture of the United States. But secondly, if they go to a centralized digital currency, how quickly till the world's hackers start hacking into this centralized database, into the wallets of politicians, so we can see where all their money is coming from. Right there, CBDCs are dead. What I do think we're seeing is, in terms of consolidation, getting things into centralized banks or larger banks. And I think that does parallel to FedNow. And FedNow, I've probably seen, has been released. That's a digital platform for the Federal Reserve, but it's not a CBDC. That is to replace SWIFT. That is for interbank operability. That's not for individual people. I just don't see it happening, knowing the culture of the United States. There would be such pushback. And there are 400 million guns in that country. You want to take their money away from them? That's the one thing all politicians know, is there's one thing everybody cares about, whether they want to admit it or not. That's their money. And they're already uneasy, and they're really not happy with the direction of inflation right now. They're not going to trust anything the government will do in terms of monetary policy, especially a complete overhaul of it. It's just not going to happen. I don't see it happening.
BJ Dichter joining us on Saga 960. We've been talking about the state of the economy around the world, not just the United States, but certainly what happens in the U.S. certainly has massive implications around the globe, whether it's interest rates, which just went up in the United States, whether it's inflation and trying to grapple with that, whether it's the possible move away from the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency. Benjamin says that's unlikely to happen. I tend to agree with him, but I think things seem to be moving in that direction when you see more and more countries saying, yeah, screw the US dollar. We don't need it. And doing more dealings in other currencies. And then you have this incredibly weak administration and inept, even self-destructive
Well,
administration in
but
the United
there's
States.
something on that a lot of people miss, which is there is a shortage in the euro dollar market, and there've been a shortage for the euro dollar market for at least 3 years, 3 4 years now. What the euro dollar market is, because we operate on the U.S. Reserve global currency, when commercial banks issue loans to businesses, corporations, entities all over the world, it's denominated in American dollars. So you could be in the United Kingdom, you can be a large corporation and go to get a loan from your bank, your commercial bank, and on the commercial side, it's going to be issued, especially if it's international, it's going to be issued in US dollars. And there's a shortage of something like 70%, like a ridiculous amount of money that has been there's been a shortfall for that money for years. And the Fed has the way the Federal Reserve operates. It's in a little bit of a bind. It can't just print money and send it to the euro dollar market. They're completely severed from one another. That's why they issue treasuries. Banks in the U.S. buy treasuries, and it stays locally in the United States. Doesn't go overseas. So that's a problem they've had for a long time, and since 2008, I think, is when it really became exacerbated. That's also why we see inflation on a number of things in the basket that the Fed uses to monitor inflation, CPI. But there's a number of things where inflation has gone down, believe it or not, and that's because it's the commercial banking sector that issues dollars. But the commercial banking sector in Europe has been short euro dollars forever. So I think there's a lot of additional things in play. It's very complex. And that's why a lot of people are, it was in another space earlier talking with these senior hedge fund managers, investors, all that sort of stuff. We don't think we're going to see the level of instability as we did in 2008, as long as the economy somewhat holds, right? Yeah, the economy is going to slow, and it's slowing down, but they have been successfully papering over all this stuff. So I don't know. It's the numbers make it look like, wow, this could be a catastrophe, but at the same time, it's not being reflected. Look at the stock market, asset prices, everything is through the roof, obviously because of inflation,
Right.
which kind of it lends itself to my thesis that they're going to paper over all of this and defer it to another several years.
Yeah, but you've also got the debt crisis. You've got the debt ceiling stuff going on, all that between Biden administration.
Yeah, but how long the U.S. has been. This is amazing. I couldn't believe this. The U.S. has been increasing its debt ceiling every year since something like 1850. It was just never reported on.
Yeah, it's lunacy. But eventually it all implodes on itself.
Yeah, for sure. Eventually, but don't drag it out.
It's not going to happen next week, but we don't know when it's going. And once the process starts, the idea of papering it over, it no longer works. I mean, there has to be an end game here, and
the end game is your Bitcoin, my friend. That is the end game.
You listen, another 30, well, not even another second. I was going to say, the end game is it Bitcoin. Gold has also done well. It's solidly, it's still over $2,000 an ounce, with predictions that it'll go up to $3,000. But I want to talk to you as well about the fact, another major indicator. You were talking about the fact that the economy is slowing. You're a truck driver, right? You see the loads, and that's oftentimes one of those bellwether signs that things are not going particularly well. What are you sensing in terms of the truck loads that you've had to work with?
Well, I'll give you some actual numbers. So, for example, one particular carrier I know of, they ship in terms of, we're talking about commodity loads. We'll talk about paper just because that's a good leading indicator. They'll ship normally approximately 500 loads to the U.S. from Canada every month. And it's consistent. It's solid every month, 500. Last month alone, they had 125 cancellations. So that is that's the sort of thing that hasn't happened since 2008. It's not quite as bad as 2008, but it's definitely a downward trend, right? So we're all seeing slowdowns in transportation. I've spoken to a couple of other truckers, some that were involved in the Freedom Convoy, some who are not in the United States, and they're all telling me the same thing. Normally, they'll be booked every day for loads, and now they're waiting an extra 24 hours, maybe 48 hours, for a backhaul, for a good paying backhaul. You know, there are loads that are available, but it's a lost leader. Nobody wants to take a lost leader. But there's definitely a slowing that's occurring, but we'll see what happens over the next 6 months to really determine how bad it is.
Talked about the possibility or the threat of empty store shelves. Haven't seen them in Florida so far. What are you seeing elsewhere?
No, not seeing any of it. Everything is, even when there was, I sent you some pictures a couple of times when there was, the media outrage and concern about, oh, look at all the storage shelves that are empty. I don't know, man. Like, I've been going all over the U.S., the upper right corner, everywhere from Rhode Island up to New Hampshire, across to Pennsylvania, that sort of area, New York, whatever. And yeah, obviously there's supply chain disruptions. We all know that, but they hadn't been catastrophic, not at any point. So I don't know. I'm pretty bullish on our ability to get through this, no matter how difficult it becomes.
You want to talk about Bitcoin Miami? You're a keynote speaker, correct?
No, I'm just going to attend. Well, I don't know where I may be doing some podcasts and I'm talking to some people about stuff. I'm not going to be on the main stage. I'm ceding my spot, I guess, to Robert F. Kennedy. And what's the guy who's running for president for the nomination for the Republicans? Vikram. I'm not going to say his last name because I'd butcher it. But now you have two. What's that?
This is the young man, right? Young
yes,
guy.
Yeah, he's what's it called? Indian descent. He's running for he's running in the primary against Republicans. So you now have a Republican nominee and a Democratic nominee, both reaching out to Bitcoin Miami, wanting to be on stage, along with Francis Suarez, who is the mayor of Miami, who's a big Bitcoiner. And this is something you never would have imagined many years ago. So yeah, I will be at Bitcoin Miami. I'll also be in, if any of your listeners are in Massachusetts, I will be in Boston next week. I'll be in Boston giving a speech, a presentation at Mass Adoption, and Miami following, and then something else in Boston in June.
Let's talk a little bit about El Salvador. I mean, it was the first country really to go into Bitcoin in a big way, right?
Yeah.
And I know a lot of people were nervous about that. A lot of the normies, a lot of the anti-Bitcoin people out there, they were quick to dump on El Salvador that this was a failed experiment, that this guy was a populist, so they hated him for that reason as well. They lumped him in with, Bolsonaro. How have things worked out? I know that on another matter, he's gone all in on law and order, but I'm not sure about their economy. What are you hearing as far as the Bitcoin experiment in El Salvador goes?
Well, their GDP apparently has jumped 10% within the first year of adopting Bitcoin. The fact that, yes, they've gone to war against MS-13 and the gangs that really were destroying that country. If you were a Salvadoran, you're essentially a hostage in your own country. Like some of the stories I've heard about it were really quite gruesome. So that has ended. And part of it started after Bitcoin was implemented, because at least the 70% of people who didn't have bank accounts in El Salvador, now they have a bank, because Bitcoin because it's a protocol, it's both a currency and an accounting system all in one. So that is your unit of account and your currency. So it's done miracles for the country. I've been in touch with a number of journalists who are down there, and people who are down there are bugging me to come down there. So I'm going to try and go down to the conference in El Salvador in November this year. But it's done wonders for the country, and it's amazing how the legacy media doesn't want to report on the success of El Salvador. All they want to do is speculate on doom and gloom in the future, but they don't have any interest in actually reporting on what's going on.
Yeah, they'll report on any bad news that they think that they can get their hands on. Like if the IMF comes out and issues a warning, like you guys better get on side here and drop this Bitcoin stuff. They'll report on that. But anything,
I think it's because the people in legacy media, they must just all be racist and bigots. That's got to be what it is. They're all racists.
Well, speaking of which, I noticed that you posted something about the Toronto mayoralty race.
Vote Bankus. So
this is, I didn't think you'd be paying a whole lot of attention to this, but it's got you tweeting about it. Why do you find this interesting?
Well, because Ben Bankus is the guy we need in the office, in the office of Mayor of Toronto. He's really going to test the cult of the woke supremacists, and let's see how woke they want to go. And he's released a bunch of videos with policies and initiatives he wants to introduce. Practical things like we will ban all white males from participating in sports. That we're going to replace our Toronto sports teams with all women's sports teams. I think the new hockey team, he said, is going to be called the Toronto OnlyFans or something like that. Let's test the woke. Let's test them on their own ideology and see how far down the rabbit hole they're willing to go with this. And I think that's an excellent idea. You'll see how quickly they'll run away from it. But he's brilliant.
There are some serious characters running in this race. I think it's the most interesting mayoralty race Toronto's ever had since the days of Rob Ford.
Well, you have a bunch of communists, and then who else?
Well, you've got Anthony Fury, who's gaining some support. You've got Chris Sky. Yeah. I don't think anybody would call him a communist. And you've got some people kind of in the middle. You've got some counselors who are running. You've got a former police, I believe a police chief, tons of people running. I don't know. It seems like it's anybody's race. Did you ever, for a second, entertain the idea of throwing your hat in the ring?
Are you crazy? Are you nuts? No way, man.
In politics in the past, so it wouldn't be the first time.
Yeah, I still wonder if that was a mistake or not. You learn a lot about people, and you see a lot of the dark sides of people when you run as a candidate. It's really kind of weird. And but yeah, it's. I mean, when we see what's her name, the one who just came out, the communist, Olivia Chow. Why the hell is she even there? I don't understand. Like what?
Because they can never get enough of being in public. Once you've had a taste of that, the perks, the power, people lobby you, they come to you and ask for things, they shower you with praise, take you out for lunch, this kind of stuff.
I think there's more to that. I think there's more to that because remember, it's technically illegal for any party to participate in municipal elections, at least in Ontario. So of course, the NDP and the Liberal Party participate in municipal politics, and they call up all the dead losers from the past and say, all right, dust them off, throw their name on a ballot, and let's see if we can get control. I think that's what's happening.
Well, what's your take on what's happening federally? We haven't spoken too much about that. The ongoing China imbroglio for the prime minister, caught lying multiple times now on the issue of what he knew and when he knew it about Chinese threats leveled against a conservative member, Michael Chong. And it just seems like now he's starting the process of tripping over his lies. And they're in the midst of their liberal conference. So far, I haven't seen any evidence that the party is turning on him, but they've got to be getting sick of this guy. Canadians are definitely sick of him. What do you think?
Well, I know there was dissent within his party during the Freedom Convoy because I was communicating through a couple of conduits in that party of a group that was forming that wanted to push a non-confidence vote to get rid of blackface because they were tired of their legacies being destroyed by this clown. So they know that. Everything that's happening on the Chinese entryism from the CCP, This is not new. Everybody knows. Everybody in Ottawa knows exactly what's going on. Like, oh, Pikachu surprise. Like, no, everybody's known since day one. Once all that money inflowed into the Trudeau Foundation, almost to the minute he was elected, all of a sudden there's millions of dollars coming in. And what just happened? The entire board of directors and the CEO left and scattered like cockroaches. But it's a really serious issue because, for many years, I was with somebody who's of Chinese descent. And I remember being explained to me that at the AGO, the Art Gallery of Ontario, several years ago, I don't remember, it was 2016, 17, something around there, they had an art installation from Ai Weiwei, a very famous Chinese author who is anti-CCP. And what was happening at the AGO was there were operatives from the Chinese CCP monitoring Chinese people that would come to the Ai Weiwei installation at the AGO, taking pictures of people, tracking who's there to see who has family back in China that they could prosecute. That's how serious this is. And the lefty Canadians, they just don't care. They really, and you know why? It's because they're a bunch of racists and bigots. It must be. They must be anti-Asian and anti-Chinese, because if they don't care that people get prosecuted and intimidated in Canada while they try to get away from the CCP, what does that tell you?
Well, it tells me that we're in big trouble if we don't deal with it.
Yeah.
Let's do a quick plug for your book before we wrap things up. How's it going, by the way, sales-wise? It was doing very well last time I heard.
It's going well. It bounces all over the place, obviously. I'm in the middle of working through the audiobook. As promised, there will be an audiobook coming out soon. And I was chuckling. I was just reading the section where the CBC completely lied to everybody in the news, and we explain that in the book. But yeah, honkingforfreedom.com. It is now also available in addition to Amazon, Kobo, and Etsy. It's also now available in the Apple Store, so you can get it there. And sometime, probably around summer, you'll see it available in audiobook form.
And maybe the movie one day.
Well,
still holding out hope. The series, wouldn't that be cool?
Have you seen how horrible movies are nowadays?
Yeah.
No. We need some of the woke stuff to dissipate first. Maybe in another 5 or 10 years, once we fix everything else.
Yeah. Hopefully it won't take that long, but who knows?
Yeah, brother.
DJ Dichter, thank you so much for coming on the show. Always a great pleasure.
As always, thank you for having me.
Let's take a break. Back with more on News Talk Saga 960 and the Mark Petrona Show after